we're going to get on moving forward with the specific aims workshop. And for this part of it here, what I'm going to do is just sort of provide a little introduction to this and how we're going to go about it. And then I'm going to try to consolidate a few tables. I want to get somewhere closer to like 6 or more people at a table, so I may grab a few tables and pull them together for you to sort of look at each other's specific aims pages, and I'll give you sort of a framework over which to do that going forward. And hopefully our other faculty members who all just ran off will be back to go through that with you as well and help you out on that. So hopefully most of you got a chance to go through the webinar that Andrew Monte and Libby put together. That was done, I think, 2 years ago, and it's still very relevant. And they also had that very nice manuscript that was in AEM as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that you've at least seen that or got a good look at it, and I'm going to summarize it essentially right here. Right, this is the recipe for a specific aims page. Right, this is the thing. Now you heard that 3 reviewers read your grant. All of them on the study section vote and provide you a score in the end when it gets discussed. And typically the specific aims page is all the other reviewers will go through. So this is the sort of critical part of this. So it really breaks down into 4 parts. You have an introductory paragraph where you basically set out what's the need, why is it a big need, and what's the potential solution. You then sort of go into the rationale, or what we call a scientific premise. How does your solution sort of address that particular need, and why is it unique and innovative is the word that they like to use. Basically, what are you going to do, who's going to do it, and why is it important? Which then leads into, in order to sort that out, these are the questions or hypotheses that we have, and here are the aims. 1, 2, 3. Typically, you won't see just one aim, and 4 aims tends to be on the high end of things. You typically see 2 or 3 aims depending on the kind of grant it is. But this is where you sort of lay out exactly what the grant will be, and then you sort of finish that off with a significance. Here's the impact. If we do this, we will have demonstrated with a randomized clinical trial that this is an effective or not effective treatment. Something like that. What is the payoff? What is the return on investment? So this was what we sort of discussed in there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the nuts and bolts and recipe. We'll assume that part you guys have sort of heard a little bit about. And what I'm going to spend some time on today is a little bit more of the flair. How do you make, because everybody uses this recipe, right? And if everybody uses it, how do you stand out? How do you get a flair for the specific aims? Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, these are not primarily my slides. Ann Libby, who was on that webinar, these were primarily her slides, and I've had the benefit of seeing her do this a couple of times, and so you'll have to bear with me, but I am a firm believer in sort of her methodology to this, and so very little tweaks to that. But basically, how do we make yours stand out? And that's a little bit of what we'll talk about today. The first thing is you got to obey the sort of norm of your particular field. So I do nanomedicine and biomedical engineering and chemical engineering, and there's just sort of certain norms. How do you write a hypothesis? Does the hypothesis come before the aims, or does it come after you've said what I'm going to do, this is what I think will happen? There's certain sort of norms depending on your group, if it's in population health versus in sort of translational research or microbiology. So there's certain sort of norms you have to sort of stick to. But ultimately, everyone has a unique voice, and everybody sort of needs to have whatever their sort of non-traditional tweaks to it that make theirs sort of stand out. And the idea is to emphasize your story. What makes your project significant? What makes you and your team uniquely qualified to perform that particular thing? And that's sort of how you emphasize your story. So there's this concept of sticky ideas. These are ideas that sort of stick in your brain and are easy to remember. It allows a reviewer to go to bat for you, right? That's what you want. You want the reviewer to be advocating for your grant, to bring all of the other people in the study section along with them, right? And so in order to do that, for people who've only read the spec aims page, they need to be concise. You need to have a very simplest possible idea. Can you boil it down to just one sentence, one word? It needs to be new or novel, right? It needs to catch an eye. You know, it's the worst thing you can have is it's like, yeah, we've been there, we've done that, we've seen this before. Even if it's a new tweak on something, a lot of times they're like, yeah, we've heard that. You don't want that sort of boring sort of feel. You want it to be unexpected. It needs to be concrete, right? It needs to be a very specific, measurable kind of thing. This is where sort of hypothesis testing is important. Can you measure what you're talking about? Credible. Where's this coming from? Where did the scientific premise come from? Did it come from science and data that you've generated, that you've outlined in the grant? Did it come from, high-impact publications prior to you that you've used to build up the argument for what you're doing forward? Emotion is what we're going to tap into a little bit now, right? You got to get them sort of emotionally involved. Is what will have them advocate for you. And the big thing is here, and we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling, right? Stories have heroes and villains and a journey and a denouement, a resolution to that, right? And that sort of emotional release is a little bit of what will help sort of elevate even sort of mediocre science sometimes will sort of be elevated by a really good story and a really good position on how you talk about it and bring that emotional effect. It's worth looking at these TED lessons where they talk about writers and they talk about how ways that they get people to sort of engage in their stories. And so I recommend going to look at it. But one of the things is when you're writing, while you want to spell things out and you want to be explicit in it, there is a little benefit of sort of anticipation and suspense, right? If you can give them sort of a sense of wanting to read more, right? The idea of suspense, I think, in writers that can do this, I think of Dan Brown, right, in the Da Vinci Code. If you talk to people who like that work, they'll tell you that I just couldn't put the book down. I had to read it from start to finish. And that's really where you want to get your reviewer to be. They've read your specific game page, and they want to know exactly how you're going to do it because they're curious. They're excited about it. And that part is the hard part, is you want to be able to spell out enough that they know what you're doing, but they want to be more curious about it. And you want curiosity, you don't want skepticism, right? That's a hard balance to have, but that is sort of what we're looking for, right? You want to evoke emotion, and sometimes, and the one emotion you don't want to evoke in your reviewer is frustration or anger. You don't want them to be tired, right? So spoon feed them, give them what they want to hear, make it easy to do. So storytelling is really a way to sort of get at this. You'll see people, really good storytellers, right, if you watch good TED Talks, right? They've been trained in how to go forward and discuss something in a way that sort of brings their audience along. One of the things is what's the point of view? Is it the researcher, is it the patient, is it the provider? So one of the sentences I've used before is, I work in medical device infection and critical illness and infection, and one of the things I say is virtually anyone reading this has a family member or has experienced an infection that required antibiotics and could potentially be life-threatening. That's very sort of emotional, right? That's getting at your family, that's getting at who you are, right? Having an infection is common. Lots of people have done it, and they can relate to that, right? That's sort of what is the point of view, right? Now, I don't recommend getting too flowery on the imagery of Dr. Stat and blood red and sirens, but you can elaborate some, right? You can sort of put that picture in your mind of the sick patient, the patient who is struggling with addiction. These things, you can evoke emotion on those. The other thing is make it easy to read. Sometimes we get into a very scientific, long, drawn-out sentences with 17 parenthetical phrases in them to pull it all together. And while that can be necessary, it's painful to read a sentence like that. You have to read it 4 times to understand it. Having sort of shorter sentences or sort of a choppier sort of movement is important. And sometimes having those breaks in the page. I don't know if you've ever seen an R01. They're only 12 pages of science, essentially. And when you do it, you'll see people cram a lot of stuff in there, and there won't even be a bit of white space. Instead of a full tab for a paragraph, there'll be like 2 spaces, right? There is sort of benefit to silence, or what I would call a blank space on the page as well, right? And getting that sort of break for the reader. So, and this is a little bit of closure, right? At the end of your specific aims page, that's when you say, the point of this is 1 sentence, right? The impact of our work will be X, right? So, everyone's going to have a little bit of different way to do this. Like I said, a unique voice or a non-traditional way to do this. Some of this might be, you might put out a case, right? to see how that might go. So what is sort of a typical case that may sort of describe from that standpoint? Or you might sort of narrate the story a little bit or present the puzzle. One of the things that many of you probably have learned is that significance, that first paragraph is a inverted pyramid, right? Where you sort of see you start with this heart disease kills more people than any other sort of disease in the United States, and I'm going to do this one little tiny thing for heart disease, right? What they call the lead. There are different ways to look at that. Some people may start and flip that upside down, right? Some of the journalists refer to that as burying the lead. Like, what's the point, right? And you want to get that out there. You certainly don't want to lead with something that they already know, right? So if you're writing to NHLBI, most of them already know that coronary artery disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States, right? Probably not a sentence you need to have in there. So you want to really get to the point in what they're doing. But read lots of grants. I think Jeremy Brown said it best. Get people's grants and read them. Talk to your mentors. Talk to your peers who have been successful. And read them and start to imitate or pull in styles that you like about them. One of the things I read in a grant not that long ago was this phrase. It said, "Let me be clear, comma," and then it was the punchline of why this is a problem, right? And they got it into a single sentence that just said, I'm going to be clear with you. This is what I think is the critical issue for this topic. And the very next thing is, this is my plan to solve that. It was so powerful because that let me be clear just sort of laid on them that they are the expert, and I'm going to describe it to you in a very succinct way as to why that is. So there are certain sort of styles you can sort of pull into that.